She had scrubbed his floors, raised his child, and learned his language. He had her deported anyway. The paper was already in her hands before she fully understood what it was. Official, stamped. Her name at the top in bold letters that had no business being that certain. Lindiwe Masondo had been awake since 5. She was always awake since 5, because Jiho sometimes called out in the night, and she had learned to sleep lightly in this house, the way you learn to sleep lightly when someone small depends on you. And she had found it slipped beneath her door like it was nothing, like it was a grocery list, like it was a reminder about dry cleaning. Official notice of deportation. You are required to vacate the Republic of Korea no later than… She stopped reading. She pressed the paper against her chest and stood in the hallway of the most expensive apartment she would ever live in. Marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of Seoul that people paid fortunes to look at. And she could not breathe. Could not think. Could only stand there with her back against the wall outside Jiho's bedroom door, listening to the soft, steady sound of a 5-year-old sleeping, completely unaware that the woman who had not missed a single morning of his life in 2 years was about to be erased from it. She called her mother. She should have called a lawyer, she knew that. But it was 5 in the morning and her hands were shaking, and the only thing that made sense was her mother's voice. "Mama!" The word came out broken. "Mama, they're sending me home." Lindiwe Masondo went quiet on the other end, that particular silence she made when she was deciding how strong she needed to be. Lindiwe knew that silence better than any sound in the world. "What do you mean? Sending you home? Sending you home how?" "A deportation notice." Lindy pressed the paper harder against her chest, as if she could stop the words on it from being real. "Mrs. Brennan filed a complaint with immigration, told them my work permit had a discrepancy, that I was living outside my registered address." Her voice fractured. "I have until tomorrow, Mama, the last flight out." 24 hours. That was all that remained of the 2 years she had spent building a life in this city. 2 years of learning a language that still sometimes tangled in her mouth. 2 years of sending money home every month, without fail, the first of every month, because her mother's roof needed fixing and her younger brother needed school fees, and Lindiwe had promised. 2 years of waking before dawn to make Jiho's breakfast exactly the way he liked it, of singing him to sleep in Zulu because it was the only thing that stopped his nightmares, of keeping this household running so smoothly that the man who owned it never once had to think about it. And Mrs. Brennan, his Mrs. Brennan, the woman he paid to manage his affairs, had made one phone call and undone all of it. "There must be something," Lindiwe said urgently. "A lawyer, an appeal." "An appeal takes 6 to 8 weeks. They won't pause the order." Lindy slid down the wall until she was sitting on the Persian rug, Jiho's scattered toys around her feet. A wooden truck, a stuffed bear with one eye missing, a drawing he'd made yesterday that he'd pressed into her hands with enormous pride. "A lion," he'd said. "That's you, Lindy, because you're brave." She stared at the drawing. She did not feel brave. She felt like a woman who had crossed an ocean with one suitcase and a determination that had never once prepared her for this specific Tuesday morning. Her mother was still talking, names, ideas, distant relatives who knew someone, but Lindiwe had stopped hearing her because the elevator at the end of the hallway had opened without a sound, footsteps, measured, unhurried, certain. She looked up. Lamnan stood 6 feet away in a black suit that still held the cold of the night outside, his tie straight, his face carrying the expression she had come to understand meant he was processing something and had not yet decided what to do with it. His eyes moved from her face to the document crushed against her chest. He could read enough of it from where he stood. The hallway contracted around them. Lindiwe scrambled to her feet, wiping her face with the back of her hand, dropping her voice to barely a breath so as not to wake Jiho. "Mr. Lam, I'm sorry. I'll be ready for Jiho's breakfast by 7. This won't affect my work. Stop! Quiet, not unkind, just absolute." She stopped. He looked at the paper, then at her. Something shifted behind his eyes, not softness, but a decision being made, the way she had seen him look before he ended a negotiation. Before he closed a deal that no one else in the room had seen coming. "How long do you have?" The question hung in the hallway air. Lindiwe's heart hammered so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Until tomorrow," she whispered. "The last flight leaves at... That's enough time." He straightened the cuff of his left sleeve, a small, precise gesture she had never understood until this moment. It was what he did when he had already made up his mind. "Come to the kitchen, I have a proposition." Lindiwe stared at him. This man who had never once asked her a personal question, who had never learned her nickname, who communicated through his assistant and left instructions on the kitchen counter in handwriting she'd had to spend 3 weeks learning to read. This man, whose name the whole of Seoul's underworld apparently did not say carelessly. "A proposition," she repeated. "Yes." "About my deportation. About your situation." He held her gaze with a steadiness that should have frightened her, and somehow, inexplicably, did not. "Come to the kitchen." He turned and walked away, completely certain she would follow. And Lindiwe Masondo, who had come from Soweto with one suitcase and a stubbornness her mother had always called either her greatest gift or her most exhausting quality, looked down at Jiho's lion drawing still in her hand, and followed. She did not yet know that the man walking ahead of her was about to offer her the one thing she had never in her life expected from anyone. A way to stay. And that accepting it was going to cost her something she hadn't known she was still capable of losing. What does a man like Lam Nan want with a woman he was about to watch be deported? And why, after 2 years of perfect invisible silence, did he come home at exactly this moment? The paper was folded in thirds, the way official documents always were, as if the people who sent them understood that bad news travelled better when it was made small. Lindiwe Masondo found it at 5:47 in the morning, pushed under the door of her room in the Lam penthouse, lying on the floor like something dropped carelessly, like something of no consequence at all. She almost stepped on it. She almost walked to the kitchen without picking it up. She didn't. She read it standing in the doorway of her bedroom in her socks, one hand still on the door handle, the cold marble of the floor seeping through the thin cotton. She read it once and understood nothing. She read it a second time and understood everything. Notice of Deportation Order, Masondo Lindiwe no Kwanda. Basis, work permit discrepancy, residential address violation. Effective, 11:59 p.m. this date. Final exit flight, 2310 Incheon International. Tonight. She sat down on the floor. Just sat down, right there in the doorway, in her socks, the paper in both hands, because her legs had simply decided this was as far as they were willing to carry her. From down the hall she could hear Jiho breathing. She could hear it because she had memorized the particular sound of that child sleeping, the slight snore, the occasional murmur, the soft rustling when he rolled over. She had been listening to that sound for 2 years. 2 years of 5 a.m. mornings, of scraped knees and nightmare vigils, and meals negotiated like peace treaties, because Jiho had opinions about broccoli that bordered on geopolitical. She pressed the paper against her chest and called her mother. Nomvula Masondo answered on the second ring, which meant she had not been sleeping either. Mothers always knew. "Mama," Lindiwe said, and that was all she managed before her voice gave way. The silence on the other end of the line lasted exactly 4 seconds. She counted them, she didn't know why, and then Nomvula said, very carefully, very quietly, "Tell me." So Lindy told her. The words came out wrong, in pieces, in the wrong order. She told her about the paper, about Mrs. Brennan, the woman in 12B who had smiled at Lindy every morning in the elevator for 18 months and apparently filed the complaint that had triggered this order. About the permit discrepancy that Lindy had been assured was corrected 6 months ago, that had apparently not been corrected, that had been quietly waiting like a landmine under the ordinary surface of her life. 2 years, she heard herself say. Her voice had gone very flat, very calm, the way voices go when emotion has simply overwhelmed the system and shut it down. I have been here 2 years. I send money home every single month. I learned the language. I learned how to say I love you in Korean before I learned how to say I am lost. And they are going to put me on a plane tonight, like I was never here at all. Nomvula made a sound that Lindy had never heard her make before. Something that lived below words. Something that a mother makes when there is nothing adequate in language for what she is feeling. There must be something, her mother said urgently. An appeal, a lawyer, someone, Lindy. I already called, 6 to 8 weeks minimum. The order doesn't pause. Then call again. Call someone else. Call... Mama. Silence. I don't know what to do, Lindiwe said. I genuinely do not know what to do. She was still sitting on the floor. Around her feet, scattered across the hallway runner, were Jiho's things. A wooden truck with a missing wheel, a drawing he'd made yesterday that he'd pressed into her hands with the solemn ceremony of a child presenting something precious. A lion, he'd announced proudly. Mane and everything, sort of. That's you, Lindy, because you're the bravest. She was staring at that drawing when the elevator at the end of the hallway slid open. No sound, just the slight movement of air that meant the doors had parted, and then footsteps she recognized without needing to look up. Measured, unhurried, the footsteps of a man who had learned long ago that urgency was a form of weakness and stillness was a form of power. Lam Nan stopped 6 feet away. He was still in his suit from whatever had kept him out until... She checked the clock on the wall, 4 a.m., which was not unusual, which had stopped being unusual approximately 3 weeks into this job when Chepo had sat her down and explained. In the blunt and loving way, Chepo explained everything, exactly who it was she was working for. His eyes moved from her face to the paper she was still clutching against her chest. He was far enough away that he should not have been able to read it. He read it. She watched him register what it said, watch something move behind his eyes, not shock, he was not a man who showed shock, but a rapid, precise recalculation. The way a chess player looks at a board that has just changed. Lindiwe scrambled to her feet, pressing herself upright against the wall, her mother's voice still a small, tinny sound coming from the phone at her side. Mr. Lam, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be in the hallway. I'll be ready for Jiho's breakfast by 7. This won't... Stop! One word. Quiet. Not unkind, just absolute. She stopped. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she had not once seen him do in 2 years of working in his home. He looked at the paper with an expression that was close to something personal. How long do you have? The question hung in the air between them. Lindy's heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. Until tonight, she whispered. The last flight leaves at... That's enough time. He straightened the left cuff of his jacket, a small, precise gesture, the kind of habit a person doesn't know they have. Come to the kitchen. I have something to say to you, and I would prefer not to say it in a hallway. He turned and walked away, entirely certain she would follow. Lindiwe looked down at Jiho's lion drawing still on the floor. She picked it up. She folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. Then she followed. The kitchen was the room Lindiwe knew best in the world and understood least. She had cooked 3,000 meals in it, give or take. She had cleaned its counters, stocked its refrigerator, navigated its appliances that cost more individually than her mother's entire house. She knew which drawer stuck and which burner ran hot, and the exact angle at which you had to hold the coffee grinder lid for it to sit flush. She knew this kitchen the way you know a place you have no power in, intimately, precisely, completely. She had never stood in it at 5 in the morning across from the man who owned it, trying not to let her hands shake. Lamnan stood at the counter with his back to the window, the city behind him still mostly dark, a few early lights beginning to blink on across Seoul. He had not taken off his jacket. He had not made coffee. He stood with his hands braced against the edge of the counter as if he were holding himself in place, or holding the counter in place, she couldn't tell which. He said it the way he said everything, without decoration, without the cushioning of unnecessary words. I need a wife. You need legal status. I am proposing we solve both problems with one document. Lindiwe heard each word individually. She understood each word individually. Together they refused to become something that made sense. You're asking me to marry you. I am asking you to enter a legal arrangement that is mutually beneficial. His eyes did not waver, not even slightly. Chairman Wu, the man who controls the organization I operate within, has given me 30 days to demonstrate what he calls personal stability. A registered marriage satisfies his condition. Your marriage to a Korean national satisfies immigration's requirement. The math is simple. The math? She repeated. Yes. She looked at him, this man who in 2 years had never once asked her how Jiho had slept, who had left instructions on the kitchen counter in handwriting. It had taken her 3 weeks to learn to read, who had just described marriage the way he might describe a tax filing, and felt something rise in her chest that was wildly, inappropriately close to laughter. No, she said. I'm sorry, no. I appreciate what you're trying to… Her phone rang. Nomvula, still on the line, or calling back. With Nomvula it was hard to tell. She didn't end calls so much as pause them, as if she assumed conversations with her daughter were ongoing and merely interrupted by life. Lindy answered and opened her mouth to say something sensible, and instead said nothing at all. Just stood there in a kitchen worth more than her mother's entire street, crying in a way she had not allowed herself to cry since she stepped off the plane at Incheon 2 years ago and told herself she couldn't afford to. She turned toward the window so Lamnan wouldn't see her face, and that was worse because the glass reflected everything back. She didn't hear him move, but when she finally stopped, chest aching, eyes stinging, the particular exhaustion of emotion that has been held back too long and now refused to be contained, she became aware that he had moved. He was sitting at the kitchen table. She had never seen him sit anywhere informal. He always stood or sat at his desk or occupied the single chair in the living room that was somehow understood to be exclusively his. He was sitting at the kitchen table, and across the marble surface he had placed a single sheet of paper. She knew what it was before she walked to the table, before she looked. She knew from the layout, from the official headers at the top, from the 2 lines of pre-filled information in handwriting she could now recognize from across a room. A marriage registration form, partially completed, in his handwriting. Neat and certain and entirely without hesitation, the way everything he wrote was. Her name was the only thing missing. Your name goes there, he said. Quiet, final, like stating a fact rather than making a request. Lindy stood looking at the paper for a long time, long enough that the city outside shifted. Some distant light going off, another coming on, Seoul beginning the process of waking up without any awareness of or interest in the small drama taking place on the 63rd floor. She thought about the last flight. She thought about Jiho's drawing in her pocket. She thought about her mother's voice saying there must be something. There must be something. There must always be something. She sat down. She picked up the pen. Her hand was completely steady. She did not understand why it was steady, but it was. She wrote her name. He looked at it, then at her. And somewhere in the precise arrangement of his face, something that was not quite an expression and not quite its absence crossed through and was gone. He stood, collected the form, and said, The office opens at 8. Baek Junseo will have the car ready at 7:45. He walked out of the kitchen. Lindiwe sat alone at the table in the expensive kitchen in the expensive apartment in the city that was trying to remove her, and stared at the window where dawn was now beginning to come, in grey and certain, and asked herself the only question she had no answer to. What world have I just agreed to enter? The registration office smelled of toner and recycled air and the particular indifference of bureaucracy. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A numbered ticket dispenser stood by the door. 3 other couples sat on plastic chairs, none of them paying any attention to anyone else. Each contained in their own quiet ceremonies, their own small enormities. Baek Junseo stood slightly behind them both with a folder of documents and an expression of careful neutrality that Lindy had come to understand was his professional setting for situations he had opinions about but would never express. Lam Nan signed first, without hesitation, the way she had seen him sign purchase orders and delivery receipts, pen moving with complete certainty, no check of the wrist, done. He stepped back, Lindy stepped forward. The pen was heavier than it should have been. She was aware of the clerk, of Baek Junseo's careful stillness, of Lam Nan standing at her left shoulder with his hands clasped, and his face doing the thing it did when he had processed a situation, and arrived at a position he intended to maintain regardless. She thought about the first time she had signed a document in this city, her employment contract in a small office that smelled of green tea, her hand shaking slightly, telling herself, "You have come too far to be afraid of a signature." She signed. The clerk stamped the document with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Outside, the Seoul morning was pale and still deciding itself, a sky that hadn't yet committed to blue. Baek Junseo had the car 3 steps from the entrance, but standing at the top of the steps, appearing from nowhere in the specific way he always appeared from nowhere, was Jiho. Nobody had told her he would be here. His whole face opened when he saw her. The complete and unreserved opening that only belonged to children, the kind of expression adults spent years learning to suppress. He ran toward her, and then remembered Lam Nan was there too, and stopped between them, looking up at one and then the other with the solemn deliberation he wore when making important decisions. Then he reached up and took both of their hands. Just like that, no ceremony, no asking, as if this were already the most natural thing. He swung their arms and started talking about noodles. A specific restaurant, a specific dish, a promise he was quite certain Baek Junseo had made. Lindiwe looked down at him, then across at Lam Nan. He was already looking at her, not at Jiho, at her. Neither of them said a word. Back at the penthouse, she called the immigration compliance line, her voice steady and her words exact. Change of marital status, effective today, documentation to follow, 4 minutes of hold music. Then, the deportation order was suspended pending review. She hung up and stood at the window with both hands around a coffee mug that had gone cold, the city spread below her in every direction. She had learned his full name this morning from the form, Lam Nan, written in 2 alphabets in his own certain hand. She was married to him. She let that fact exist in the room without yet deciding what to do with it. She learned his schedule before she learned anything else about him. Out by 7. Baek Junseo at the door by 6:55. Never a minute late, never a minute early. Home rarely before 10, sometimes much later. The low hum of the elevator, a sound she began to register, even in half sleep. The way you register the particular sound of a person you have begun, despite every intention, to listen for. The arrangement had rules, unspoken but clear as anything written down. Her life was the left wing of the penthouse, his was the right. Jiho was the middle, belonging to both and neither, moving between them with the freedom of a child who didn't yet understand that walls existed. She told herself it was fine. It was, in fact, exactly what had been agreed upon. But the small things accumulated. He always checked Jiho's room before his own. Every night, regardless of what time he came in, she would hear the soft click of that door, and a silence that lasted exactly long enough to confirm the boy was sleeping and covered. She had not told him about the week in October when Jiho had woken from nightmares 3 nights running. He had figured it out. She could tell by the way the intervals changed, the way the silence after the click grew longer in those weeks, more careful. He left the kitchen light on when he knew she woke early. She had not told him she woke early. He never mentioned the lullabies. Every night she sat on Jiho's bed and sang softly in Zulu, old songs her mother had sung to her, songs that belonged to a different sky. And he never said a word. Until one morning, Baek Junseo appeared in the kitchen while she was making breakfast and said, without looking up from his phone, "He mentioned the boy sleeps better now." Then he accepted the coffee she offered and said nothing further, as if he had not just handed her something significant. She was not supposed to be collecting these things. She knew that. She was a practical woman who had crossed an ocean on a work permit and rebuilt her life on the specific and unglamorous foundation of showing up and doing the job. She was not supposed to be standing at the kitchen window at 6 a.m. cataloguing the small, considerate habits of a man who had described their marriage as math. And yet, the trouble arrived on a Tuesday, which was the wrong day for trouble. Tuesdays were ordinary, domestic, unremarkable. Jiho had swimming. She was folding laundry in the hallway. She heard voices in the study. Lam's voice and someone else's. A voice she didn't recognize, speaking in Korean too fast for her to follow. She didn't mean to listen. But the hallway was narrow and the study door was ajar, and the voice on the other side was getting louder, and then she heard her name. Her name, Lindiwe, said by a stranger's voice, in a tone that was not kind. She stood very still. The voice continued. Korean, mostly, but there were enough English words threaded through, documents, immigration, arrangement, fabrication, that she understood the shape of what was being said, even when she couldn't catch every word. And she heard Lam's response, controlled, measured, the register he used when he had no intention of losing. But she also heard, beneath that control, something she had not heard in him before. Effort. The specific effort of a man who was working harder than he appeared to be working. She set the laundry down carefully and went to her room. She called Chepo. "Oh, Sung-min," Chepo said, before Lindy had even finished explaining. She could hear Chepo sitting up straighter on the other end of the line, the way she always did when something became serious. "I've heard the name. He's been after Lam's position for years. He has ears everywhere, Lindy. If he knows about the marriage—" "He knows," Lindy said. "He's building a case. He's going to argue to Chairman Wu that it's fraudulent." Silence. "Is it?" Chepo asked very quietly. "Fraudulent?" Lindiwe sat on the edge of her bed, in a room that was more beautiful than any room she had ever slept in a city that had once tried to expel her, married to a man she barely knew, and considered the question. "I don't know what it is," she said. "That's the problem." The crisis came 3 days later, the way crises always came, not when you were braced for them, but in an ordinary moment, during an ordinary task, when your guard was down because you had begun to believe the ordinary was permanent. She was in Jiho's room, finishing the nightly routine, the negotiation over teeth brushing. This was ongoing and unresolved. The reading of exactly 2 books, non-negotiable. The checking under the bed for the creature Jiho referred to only as the One, which had never been found, but whose absence could not be taken for granted. Jiho grabbed her hand as she turned to go. "Lindy, are you and Appa going to leave?" She turned back. He was looking at her with the particular directness of a 5-year-old who had not yet learned that some questions are complicated. "Where did you hear that?" "I heard people talking." His brow was furrowed in a way that made him look eerily like Lam Nan. "Are you going to leave and not come back, like Ioma did?" The air left the room. She hadn't known. She had known there was no mother in the picture. This was obvious, had been obvious from the first day. but she had not known the specific shape of that absence, had not known what word Jiho used for it, had not known that the fear of people leaving without coming back was something he carried around in his small 5-year-old chest every single day. She sat back down on the bed. She took both his hands in hers. She lied. She told him no one was going anywhere. She said it firmly and clearly, in the voice she used when she needed him to believe something completely, and she watched his face relax and his shoulders drop and his eyes begin to go heavy. She sat with him until he was deeply, fully, safely asleep. Then she walked to the kitchen and stood at the window in the dark for a very long time, pressing her forehead against the cool glass, looking at the city below, thinking about what it meant to make a promise to a child when you did not know yet if you could keep it. She heard his footsteps at 11:30, heard the elevator, heard the careful quiet of him moving down the hall, the pause at Jiho's door, the silence. She heard the pause last longer than usual. She didn't turn around when she heard him come into the kitchen. "He asked me tonight if we were going to leave," she said, like his mother left. The kitchen was very quiet for a long moment. "I know," Lam Nan said. And from those two words, from the weight of them, she understood that he had been carrying that particular fear for much longer than tonight. They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen in the dark, the expensive, beautiful, enormous kitchen, and the city burned below them, and neither of them said anything else, and somehow that was the most honest conversation they had ever had. Seo-yeon arrived from London on a Thursday and immediately decided she and Lindiwe were going to be close. This was not a suggestion. Seo-yeon Lam did not make suggestions. She was 31, 2 years younger than her brother, and where Lam Nan moved through the world with the strategic precision of someone who had learned to want very little, Seo-yeon moved through it as if she were testing its tensile strength. She wore perfume that arrived before she did. She had already read the situation, all of it, Lindy suspected, down to details she hadn't been told, by the time she set her suitcases down in the guest room and walked to the kitchen to introduce herself. "You're the most interesting thing that's happened to my brother in years," she said, extending a hand. "I intend to be deeply involved." Lindiwe shook her hand. "Does he know that?" Seo-yeon smiled. "He will." 4 days later, Seo-yeon was in Lindy's doorway, holding a dress that was deep green and simple, and somehow absolutely correct in a way Lindy could not have articulated. "Chairman Woo's dinner," she said. "You're going. Lam is taking you, and you are not walking into that room looking like you have anything to apologize for." Lindy looked at the dress. "I don't own anything to—" "This is yours now. Put it on." The dinner was in a building that had no name visible from the street, on a floor that required a private elevator code. Low light, precise table arrangements, the food incidental to the architecture of power it was served within. Lindy felt the room's attention before she could identify its source, the particular quality of being assessed by people who had already formed opinions and were now testing them against reality. She had felt this before, in every room that wasn't designed to hold her. Oh Sung-min was there. She knew him immediately, not from any introduction, but from the way Lam's hand found the small of her back when they entered. Firmer than necessary, not possessive, protective. She filed that information carefully. The evening was a study in surfaces. She spoke easily, asked questions that made senior men feel regarded, laughed at the right moments, kept her expression warm and her observations private. Beside her, she felt Lam register this, the slight shift of his weight, something that might have been surprise, might have been something else. Oh Sung-min raised his glass to her from across the room at one point, smiling the kind of smile that communicated everything he wasn't saying. She smiled back. She looked away first. She had grown up in a neighborhood where knowing exactly when to disengage was a survival skill. In the car afterward, the city scrolling past in dark and light, she asked, "Who is he to you exactly?" Lam was quiet for long enough that she thought he had decided not to answer. Then he spoke, measured at first, then less so. He told her about the organization's structure, about the precise shape of Chairman Wu's patients, about what Oh Sung-min had been building toward for 6 years, and what he was willing to sacrifice to get there. He told her more than he intended to. She could hear the exact moment he realized it, a small pause, a slight recalibration, but he continued anyway, as if he had crossed a line he didn't see the point in retreating from. She listened without flinching, without filling the silence with reassurance, without asking questions that would let him slow down. She received what he said and held it steadily. When he finished, she said, "He'll use the marriage." "He's already using it." "And the 30 days? 22 remaining." She looked out the window. "Then we should look like people who chose each other," she said, "not people who signed a form under pressure." He was quiet for a moment. "What does that look like to you?" She thought about it honestly. "I think it looks like two people who know things about each other that they haven't said out loud yet." They ended up on the rooftop. She wasn't entirely sure how. One of them had suggested it, or neither of them had, and somehow the elevator had taken them up instead of down. The cold was clean and sharp, Seoul burning below them in every direction, the Han River a dark ribbon in the distance. They stood at the railing without speaking for a while. "You are not afraid of me," he said. It was not a question. Lindy considered the city. "I grew up in Soweto," she said. "I learned early that fear is not the most useful tool." "What is?" She thought about it. "Paying attention." He turned to look at her. Not the assessing look she had learned to recognize, the one he wore when he was calculating something, but something different, something slower. "What have you paid attention to?" he asked. "About me." "That you check Jiho's room every night before your own, that you leave the kitchen light on when you know I'm awake early, that you never once commented on the lullabies." She paused. "That you sit at the kitchen table when you've decided to say something true." The silence that followed was different from all the other silences. It had a different texture. Something in it was not closed. He almost smiled, just barely, a small, barely there shift at the corner of his mouth that lasted no more than a second and then was gone. But she caught it. She had been watching carefully enough to catch it. She decided, standing on that rooftop in the cold night air of a city that had once tried to send her home, that she was going to spend an unreasonable amount of time figuring out how to see that again. The summons came on a Wednesday, delivered by Baek Jun-seo at 8 in the morning with the careful tone of a man presenting information he wished he didn't have. Chairman Wu. That evening, both of them. Baek Jun-seo did not use the word both unnecessarily. She understood. She spent the morning not preparing anything in particular. She dressed carefully, white blouse, dark trousers, the small gold earrings Nomvula had pressed into her palm at OR Tambo Airport the day she left Soweto. "Wear them when you need to remember who you are," her mother had said, in the matter-of-fact way Nomvula said things that were profound. Jiho found her in the kitchen at 9, trailing his blanket, hair horizontal. He climbed into the chair across from her and studied her face with the alarming perceptiveness of a child who had learned to read adult weather. "Are you going somewhere important?" "Yes." "Is Appa going with you?" "Yes." He considered this. Then he slid off the chair, disappeared down the hall, and returned 2 minutes later with 3 drawings clutched in both hands. He laid them on the kitchen table and smoothed each one down carefully. "For your pocket," he said. "So you have brave things." She folded all 3 and put them in her pocket without saying anything, because there was nothing adequate. Lam appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:30. He was dressed the way he dressed for rooms where everything mattered. His eyes found hers briefly, then moved to Jiho. "We'll be back before you're asleep," he told Jiho, with the certainty of a man who understood that a promise to a child was a different category of commitment. Jiho nodded seriously. "I'll be awake anyway," he announced, "in case." Lam almost smiled. Lindy caught it. She had gotten faster at catching it. The building had no public listing, 34th floor. The elevator required a card she didn't have. Lam produced it without comment. The corridor was silent, in the way of places where a great deal of controlled force had been practiced for a very long time. 8 men in the room. Dark suits. The careful stillness of people who had learned to contain considerable things. Oh Sung-min stood to the right of Chairman Woo's chair. He had the expression of a man who had prepared thoroughly and was certain he had won. The disciplined satisfaction of someone who would call it professionalism. He presented his case methodically, the timeline of the marriage and its proximity to Chairman Woo's ultimatum. Documentation of the prior distance between Lamnan and his wife, separate public schedules, no record of a relationship preceding the registration by even a day. Staff testimony carefully selected. He used the word fabrication once, placed it in the room like a knife on a table, and left it there. Chairman Woo listened without expression. He was a man in his 70s who had survived things that would have unmade other people, and the fact of his survival was present in the room the way gravity is present. You couldn't see it, but everything organized around it. When Oh Sung-min finished, Chairman Woo looked at Lam Nan for a moment. Then he looked at Lindiwe. Not at both of them, at her, specifically. With the steady, diagnostic attention of someone who had spent decades reading people for truth and finding it in the places they didn't think to guard. "Tell me," he said in English, "about your husband." The room went very still. She felt Lam beside her, absolutely motionless, and understood with complete clarity that this was not a moment he could enter. Whatever she said next, she said alone. She did not speak about love. She didn't reach for the word. It would have sounded like a performance, and Chairman Woo had seen too many performances to be moved by one more. She spoke about Ji-ho, what he ate and what he refused to eat, and the 18-month negotiation over green vegetables that had so far produced one grudging acceptance of edamame. The nightmare he'd had in October, 3 nights running, for no reason she had ever identified, and how she had sat on the floor of his room until 4 in the morning because leaving had felt impossible. The word he'd invented for the creature he believed lived under his bed, and the careful ritual of checking for it every single night, and the way he only fell completely asleep when he was satisfied the check had been thorough. She spoke about nomvula, what it costs to leave, what it means to send money home every month and know that money is the difference between certain things being possible and not possible. What kind of love produces a woman who boards a plane with 1 suitcase and rebuilds herself from scratch in a language that is not her own, in a city that doesn't know her name because the people she loves need her to? She spoke about Soweto, about what it teaches you about entering rooms that were not built to include you, about surviving not as performance, not as something you display to convince people, but as a daily practice, quiet and unglamorous and ongoing, until it simply becomes indistinguishable from the way you live. She spoke about a man who left the kitchen light on. She said it simply, without explanation. She watched 2 of the 8 men in the room register it. She watched Chairman Woo register it. She did not raise her voice. She did not appeal for anything. She simply stood in that room and was entirely herself, and let that be sufficient. When she finished, the silence had a different quality. Chairman Woo looked at Lam Nan for a long moment. Something passed between them, something that had no name in a language she knew. Then, "She stays." 2 words. Oh Sung-min's case collapsed in the space between them. The corridor outside was empty and fluorescent and smelled of nothing. Their footsteps were the only sound. Lindy was focused on keeping her breathing even, on not letting her legs communicate to the rest of her body how the last 40 minutes had actually felt when Lam Nan's hand found hers. Not for the room was behind them. There was no one watching, nothing to maintain, no audience requiring it. He simply took her hand and held it. She looked straight ahead, and so did he, and neither of them said a word the entire length of the corridor and the whole way down in the elevator. She didn't let go either. 3 months after the corridor, he came to find her in the kitchen on a Sunday morning. Sunday mornings were the one time the penthouse breathed differently. Jiho still asleep, the city below doing something slower than its usual relentless pace. The light coming in from the east in long flat bars that made everything look provisional and gentle. She heard him before she saw him. The slightly different sound of his footsteps when he wasn't moving with purpose, when he was moving toward rather than between things. She had learned the difference. She had learned a great many things without meaning to. He sat across from her at the kitchen table. He placed a folder between them. "Open it," he said. Inside was a contract. Clean, official, the details precise. Senior program coordinator, one of his legitimate holdings. Salary that would anchor a visa independently. Benefits, a start date 3 weeks from now. She looked at it for a long time. "You don't need me for your papers," he said. "I want to make sure you have a choice." She looked up. He was holding her gaze with a steadiness she had come to understand was not distance but the opposite. The way he looked when he was waiting for something that mattered. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that a different kind of person might have started talking to fill it. He didn't. "What if I don't want to stop being married?" she said. Something moved across his face that was entirely unlike the almost smile she'd been collecting since the rooftop. This was larger than that and less controlled, arriving before he could arrange it into anything composed. He looked at her the way Jiho looked at her when he'd found something he'd thought was lost, with a specific, unguarded relief. He reached across the table. He closed the folder. Seo-yeon organized the second ceremony with the authority of someone who had been waiting for a reason and intended to use it fully. She rearranged the penthouse living room the evening before with a specificity that brooked no disagreement. She had opinions about every table placement, every surface, the exact angle at which natural light should enter. Baek Jun-seo moved furniture without comment. Lam Nan stood in the doorway of the living room, watched his sister direct the reorganization of his home, and said nothing, which was itself a kind of love. It was small by most measures, the people who had been present for all of it in one way or another. Jiho served as ring-bearer, with a solemnity entirely disproportionate to his 5 years. He walked with enormous ceremony, both rings on the small pillow Seo-yeon had found, jaw set, eyes serious. Then he dropped one ring. He retrieved it without embarrassment, replaced it carefully, and continued as if nothing had happened. Nomvola was on the screen propped against the bookshelf, a video call that Chepo had spent an hour setting up from Soweto, the connection dropping twice before it held. She started crying the moment the call connected. The laughing kind of crying, the kind that means joy has exceeded the body's capacity to contain it neatly. "My child," she kept saying in Zulu, between the laughing and the crying. "My child, my child." Seo-yeon's speech lasted 11 minutes. It covered in considerable and specific detail every emotionally compromising thing she had personally witnessed her brother do over the preceding months. Lam Nan stared at a fixed point above her head for the duration of it. He did not tell her to stop. That too was a kind of love. Baek Jun-seo stood at the back of the room with his arms folded and his face entirely composed. He was absolutely not crying. He was very clear about this afterward to anyone who raised the subject, which several people did. Chairman Wu sent flowers, white, structured, arriving with a small card on which he had written only his name. From him, this was the equivalent of a standing ovation. A year later, the Child Development Programme had 37 enrolled children across 2 districts, funded quietly through Lam's legitimate holdings. Chepo had moved into an apartment 2 floors below them and was calling it a coincidence with decreasing conviction. Jiho had learned 3 Zulu words, sawubona, salakale, and umuntu, and deployed them strategically in situations calculated to produce maximum confusion in his kindergarten class. His teacher had sent a note home. Lindy had written back in Korean, in the careful handwriting she had spent a year developing, explaining the words' meanings. The teacher had sent a second note saying she was going to look into teaching them to the whole class. One morning, Lindy stood at the penthouse window with her coffee, soul spread below in early light, and thought about a Tuesday. A hallway, the particular sound of official paper being slid under a door. She thought about 5:47 a.m. and a woman sitting on a carpet in her socks, holding a deportation order against her chest, absolutely certain there was no door left. She pressed her hand to the glass, the cool of it, the solid fact of it. Behind her, she heard Jiho's room door open, the particular sound of a 5-year-old who had woken and immediately begun moving, because Jiho had no intermediate setting. She heard small feet on the floor. She heard him bypass the bathroom entirely, which was a conversation for later. She heard Lamb's door too, heard the quiet certainty of his footsteps. She did not turn away from the window yet. She just listened to the sounds of a Sunday morning, Jiho's voice lifting into a question, and then the low, careful register of a response. The sound of the kitchen beginning to come alive. Her family. The word had no performance in it, it was simply accurate. A thing that had become true through the accumulation of ordinary mornings, of kept promises, of hands held in empty corridors for no audience at all. She turned away from the window. She went to the kitchen where 2 people she loved were waiting, the city enormous and glittering behind them, soul warm inside the glass. "How long do you have?" he had asked her that first morning in the hallway. She hadn't known then, she knew now, forever it turned out. The answer had always been forever,